What is happening here?
There's nothing left to say right now about that.
The story of the Brown family has always seemed complicated, chaotic, and emotional outwardly. But what nobody ever saw was behind the camera scenes, the carefully edited episodes, and the confessional interviews. There was a much deeper truth there, a truth that Kody Brown never wanted out. A truth that family members whispered about privately long before the world ever suspected anything was wrong. And it all begins years before the explosive moments that people witnessed on television. To many viewers, the implosion of the Brown family came out of nowhere. One season, they were together, supportive, and committed to making plural marriage work. The next, it all unraveled. For the people inside the family, especially Christine, Janelle, and the older children, the dissolution had been a long time coming. It wasn't one fight, one move, or even one disagreement. It was a slow shift happening behind the scenes, a shift in Kody himself no one fully understood until it was too late. In the early days, Kody was the energetic, enthusiastic leader of a plural family. He had big dreams and spoke of unity, teamwork, building a lifestyle that would prove the doubters wrong. But as time passed, something changed. His dreams grew bigger, louder, more dramatic, while his actions grew smaller, more controlling, more unpredictable. The wives noticed this change long before their audience ever did. They watched him transition from a man chasing unity to a man chasing something else entirely, a status, admiration, and sense of power that came with being the head of a large, televised plural family. The truth Kody never wanted out was that he wasn't just struggling with plural marriage, he was struggling with the role he created for himself. And the more he felt that slipping away, the more he tightened his grip on every part of the family. The wives quietly discussed it with each other, but never on camera. The kids whispered about it when he wasn't around. Even close friends noticed the change, but no one was brave enough to speak publicly. Not yet. Christine was the first to question it openly. She didn't do it in anger, even though fans eventually saw her frustration boil over. In the beginning, she simply asked small questions about decisions he made without consulting anyone, about the constant shifting of plans, about the pressure he placed on the family to follow him even when they didn't understand where he was going. Kody brushed it off, telling her she was being emotional or dramatic. But she wasn't. She saw a side of him no one else was willing to see. One of the biggest early warning signs came during the Vegas years. To outsiders, that period looked like the happiest time for the family. They had beautiful homes, their kids were thriving, and they appeared more unified than ever. But internally, the pressure was building. Kody's idea of leadership began shifting. Instead of guiding the family, he wanted the family to follow him without question. When disagreements came up, instead of mediating, he shut them down. He created a pattern of behavior the wives didn't want viewers to see, where his opinion mattered more than theirs and his decisions were final whether anyone agreed or not. Janelle noticed it in the daily operations. Finances, schedules, parenting decisions, all of it seemed to revolve around Kody's impulses rather than practical planning. Christine noticed it in their marriage. Emotional support was becoming more rare. Robyn noticed it too, though she stayed quiet, trying not to appear as if she took sides. And Meri felt it harshest. She had been gradually pushed to the margins, and the distance grew wider each year. But the biggest truth, the one Kody absolutely did not want out, was that while the family all lived together, he had started putting his emotional investment into just one household. Not on paper, not publicly, not in any easily verifiable way, but emotionally and psychologically, he was drifting toward one wife, one house, and one version of family life, which made the others feel like afterthoughts. The wives felt that imbalance long before the audience did. In fact, the show hid much of it. TLC filmed group scenes, celebrations, dinners, meetings, road trips, anything that made the family appear balanced. But behind the cameras, the wives knew which direction Kody was leaning. They knew who he listened to more, who he visited more, who he spent more time with off camera. It wasn't subtle for them. It was a painful shift they felt deeply. Christine tried to bring it up over and over, even suggesting counseling. She hoped that maybe, if they addressed the imbalance early, things could improve. But instead of hearing her concerns, Kody became defensive. He insisted he wasn't favoring anyone. He blamed Christine's insecurities, saying that if she were a better sister wife or more supportive, she wouldn't feel that way. It was a tactic he used often, dismissing concerns rather than addressing them. What Christine did not show to the viewers was how she would cry off screen, how many nights she sat alone and replayed conversations, wondering if she was overreacting, how many times she confided in her older kids old enough to understand what happened. The truth was becoming clear to her, even while she wasn't ready to accept it. All the while, Kody was pushing the family onto bigger and riskier plans that made no sense to the wives, but somehow did to him. The biggest example was the Flagstaff move. To viewers of the show, this seemed like a group decision, but in reality, the wives knew where it came from: Kody. The urgency came from Kody, and so did the pressure to agree. He insisted it was destiny, it would bring the family closer, and that the old environment was toxic. But deep down, the wives knew something else was driving him: a desire to start fresh on his terms with less resistance from those who questioned him. For many of the Brown children, Flagstaff was the breaking point. They lost friends, stability, schools, and homes they loved. Christine's kids were more outspoken, imploring them to allow them to remain in Vegas, even sharing their feelings of not being heard with their mom. But Kody bulldozed forward, convinced he knew best. And when it created chaos, ruined their finances, and shattered their routines, he refused to concede he'd made a mistake. This was another truth he never wanted exposed. His biggest decisions weren't based upon family unity, but upon his impulses, and it was always the family that paid the price. By the time Flagstaff finally materialized, the wives had silently created their own emotional distances. They were no longer one family anymore, but four separate households bound only by a man who still thought he was in control. And then came the pandemic, and things only got worse. The pandemic revealed everything the wives had been silently enduring for years. Kody's favoritism became undeniable. His inconsistent rules, his unpredictable behavior, his emotional abandonment of most of the older children had grown up knowing the reality of plural marriage, that it required sacrifice, patience, cooperation, and communication. But what they didn't expect was how unbalanced things would be when he slowly started not to show up for everyone equally. They noticed which homes he would go to. They noticed when he would stay longer at one house and would quickly make excuses to leave early from another. They noticed when he suddenly was strict about rules with some kids and relaxed and flexible with others. And so the resentment grew quietly, oozing through the family long before cameras ever captured it. For Christine's kids, the transition was most heartbreaking. They had always looked to Kody for comfort, laughter, and guidance. He was the father who played with them, teased with them, made them feel part of the family. But in Flagstaff, that Kody disappeared, all but overnight. He became strict, cold, and hyper-focused on control. He began preaching rules that didn't make sense to them, demanding that their mother reinforce them, even when she disagreed. And when they spoke up, he cut them down. He was a man with one story, one priority, one focus, and it was easy for everyone to see which home was most important. But here's the truth that Kody worked hardest to hide: the emotional desertion that happened long before the wives officially began leaving him. It wasn't just a failing marriage, it was a failing connection to his children. They were the first to realize that something was deeply wrong. They whispered to their mom, asking why he didn't visit. They questioned why they had to follow rules he didn't follow himself. They watched him pick fights over small things but ignore their emotional needs entirely. And when they expressed their frustrations, Kody interpreted it as disrespect instead of pain. Janelle's kids noticed it too. They had always viewed their dad as a strong presence, someone who kept the balance between households even. But now, balance was gone. They saw their mom trying her hardest to keep peace between everyone, but they also saw Kody turning every disagreement into a confrontation. He started blaming her for the kids' independence, their choices, even their personalities. And instead of his children being people with different needs, he saw them as obstacles to the narrative that he wanted to maintain. Meanwhile, the wives were fighting their silent battles. Each one was feeling Kody's emotional withdrawal differently. Christine felt dismissed, unvalued, and unseen. Janelle felt forced into mediating conflicts she did not create. Meri felt completely isolated, treated like an outsider in her own family. And Robyn, well favored, felt the weight of being placed in the center of the storm, because even she knew how the situation appeared, and even she felt guilty for the imbalance. But the truth Kody never wanted out wasn't only about favoritism. It was about fear. A growing fear that he was losing control of the story he has spent a decade crafting for the public. For years, he thrived on the image of a capable, confident, fun patriarch of a large plural family. But that image only worked when the wives were unified, when the kids admired him, and when the household followed his lead. Once the wives began questioning him, once the kids started speaking up, once the arguments began affecting filming, he panicked. Not visibly, not in a dramatic breakdown. His panic showed in his decisions, in his increasing need for control, in his growing defensiveness, in his refusal to accept responsibility for anything going wrong. The pandemic arrived like a magnifying glass, exposing every weakness in the family dynamic. Kody saw it as an opportunity to regain control. He instituted strict rules, more restrictive than the guidelines anyone else was following. He insisted the rules were necessary, that they were about safety. But the wives knew better. The rules gave him leverage. They gave him a way to decide who was cooperative and who was against him. They allowed him to determine which households he visited and which he avoided. And gradually, the rules turned into a weapon. When Christine's or Janelle's kids would question the logic behind the rules, Kody would get angry. He said they were attacking him. He said they were being disrespectful. He said they were making it harder on the family. But in reality, he couldn't handle losing in any area of his life. The tighter the squeeze, the tighter he tried to hold the reins, especially where the most vulnerable were concerned, his children. By this time, the emotional climate in the family was rapidly changing. Christine's resentment had been building, an anger not birthed from bitterness, but from heartbreak. She watched her kids as they struggled with loneliness and confusion. She watched them question why Dad no longer cuddled them or made time for them. She watched them pull away, not because they didn't care, but because they were tired of always having to make the effort. Janelle saw the same thing play out in her home. And though level-headed herself, even she would admit the truth. The kids no longer looked at their father as a safe place emotionally. This is the part of the story Kody wanted buried forever. The idea that the world would see the collapse didn't start with the wives. It started with his relationship with his children. The kids were the true mirrors of the family, and their withdrawal exposed everything. They saw favoritism, they saw abandonment, they saw inconsistency, and they saw a father who didn't want to admit any of it. The more filming continued, the harder Kody tried to shape his image. He was confident in interviews, using strong language about leadership and unity. He blamed circumstances, he blamed stress, and he even blamed his wives for the growing tensions within the family. But the more he defended himself, the more cracks seemed to appear. His own children began to voice frustrations on camera, something they had never done before. And when they did, the audience started to see the truth. Not the polished truth of the show, but the real truth the wives had been living with for years. Christine had begun quietly planning her escape long before she announced it. She didn't decide out of anger or in the heat of a fight. She decided after years of watching her children lose the father they once adored. She knew staying meant more pain, more confusion, and more instability. The truth Kody never wanted exposed was that Christine didn't leave to betray him. She left to protect her kids. And deep down, Kody knew it. That's why he fought so hard to control the narrative. That's why he blamed her repeatedly. Because acknowledging her reasons meant acknowledging his failures. Part 2 ends with the growing divide. Wives drifting further from their husband, children pulling back emotionally, and Kody determined to maintain an image of control even as the family slipped through his fingers. The truth he never wanted out was now undeniable, and the foundation of the Brown family was already cracking, long before the public would ever see the full collapse. The tension inside the Brown family continued to rise long after the move and the initial adjustment period. What started as frustration was slowly turning into something much heavier and harder to ignore. The wives were no longer confused about what was happening. The kids were no longer blaming the move or the chaos of a new city. Everyone was starting to realize that the real issue wasn't location, distance, or changing circumstances. It was Kody's shift in behavior, priorities, and presence. And once that realization took hold, things could never go back to the way they used to be. Christine felt this shift most profoundly. She had always been one of those wives who believed in the family structure being maintained at all costs. Over the years, she worked hard to make sure the kids felt safe, connected, and supported. She encouraged unity between households, helped manage schedules, and tried to make every holiday and family gathering meaningful. Now, she was observing the family dissolve from within, and she felt powerless to stop it. Their children's faces were a tell-all. The disappointment, confusion, and growing emotional distance from their father tore her heart apart. The breaking points weren't loud or dramatic. There were no big fights or explosive confrontations. Instead, it was a series of small moments, barely noticeable to anyone outside the home, but deeply significant to the people living through them. Kody began canceling visits more frequently, explaining that he was too busy or that the other households needed him more. He dismissed emotional conversations with stiff, dismissive reactions. When the kids tried to talk to him, they felt brushed aside or criticized. And when the wives tried to explain what they were witnessing, he saw it as criticism rather than a cry for help. Janelle watched this happen with a growing sadness in her heart. She had always been the voice of reason, the wife who tried to keep emotions grounded and conflicts manageable. But even she couldn't deny what the kids were feeling. She saw them withdrawing, seeking comfort from each other instead of their dad. She heard them express disappointment when he didn't show up. She noticed their body language change during conversations about him, and she knew something was breaking that might never be repaired. Meanwhile, Meri watched everything from a different vantage point, part of the family, yet emotionally and physically set apart from them. She knew abandonment more than anyone. She knew the feeling of being replaced, looked over, or minimized. And though she tried to rise above it, she felt this heavy, quiet sadness watching the kids go through that same thing. She wanted to protect them, but she was too far removed from the inner circle to step in. Her own relationship with Kody was strained, distant, and filled with unresolved pain. She knew the kids were seeing a side of him she had learned to live with years ago. But the one who felt the shift the hardest was Christine. She was the one the kids came to when they felt unheard. She was the one who answered their questions when they asked why their dad acted the way he did. She was the one who held them when they cried after feeling ignored. And she was the one who carried the emotional weight of the family's unraveling even when she didn't want to. She tried to keep hope alive, repeating to herself that things could still get better. But deep down, she knew the truth. Things were changing because Kody was changing, and he didn't see it. For his part, Kody felt like he was acting out of necessity. In his mind, his choices were reasonable, justified, and sometimes even noble. He managed to convince himself that the wives were overreacting, the kids were being influenced by negative emotions, and all the family needed was time to adjust. He didn't see the fissures appearing, or rather, he refused to see them, because to acknowledge those fissures meant acknowledging that he was losing control, and losing control was something he had never learned to handle. As filming continued, the cameras captured moments that hinted at deeper issues. They caught looks of disappointment on the kids' faces. They recorded awkward pauses and tense family conversations. They showed the wives trying to explain their perspectives to Kody, only to be deflected by his constant defensiveness. But what cameras didn't catch, what the world didn't see, were the private moments behind closed doors, the quiet tears, the whispered conversations between siblings, the late-night talks between mothers and children, the emotional exhaustion that filled the homes every night. There were key incidents that marked turning points, moments that seemed small but changed everything. One such moment occurred in the course of a conversation Christine was having with one of her daughters. After weeks of being ignored by their father, the question this daughter asked was simply stated, but pierced deeply. Why doesn't he want to be with us? And it pierced Christine in a way she hadn't expected. It was the kind of question no mom wants to answer when the truth is complicated and heartbreaking. She realized then that the issue was not between her and Kody anymore. It involved the kids in ways she could no longer deny. Another turning point came when one of Janelle's sons confronted Kody directly. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse. He simply expressed how hurt he felt. But instead of hearing the pain, Kody heard disrespect. He responded with firmness, frustration, and authority. The conversation ended with deeper wounds instead of healing. Janelle watched it unfold, helpless and frustrated, knowing that the moment would remain etched in her son's memory forever. Even Robyn, who had always been the closest to Kody, began noticing the emotional fallout. She saw the kids pulling away. She heard the tone in Kody's voice when he talked about the other households. She noticed how tense the wives became during group discussions. And she felt the pressure of being viewed as the favorite, a title she didn't want but couldn't avoid. She felt trapped between supporting her husband and acknowledging the pain of the other wives. And even she began to sense that something fundamental was shifting. The truth Kody never wanted out wasn't some secret event or hidden scandal. It was the emotional collapse of a family he thought he held together. He was blind to how his choices were driving people away, not drawing them in. He wasn't able to see how different it was to be a leader and not to be controlling. He wasn't able to admit how his own actions hurt those he said he loved the most. As those relationships deteriorated, the kids started to form their own interpretations of what was happening. Some thought their dad. As the days unfolded inside the Brown family, the air grew heavier with tension that no one could fully explain, yet everyone could feel. Conversations were shorter, glances sharper, and even the children sensed that something was shifting beneath the surface. What nobody knew, not even the wives, was that Kody was holding on to a secret so deeply buried it had quietly shaped every major decision he'd made for years. And now, under mounting pressure, that secret was beginning to crack open. Christine was the first to notice how dramatically Kody's behavior changed. He was restless, pacing the house at odd hours, disappearing for long stretches without explanation, then returning with this energy that was both defensive and strangely determined. She tried asking him what was going on, but Kody brushed her off with vague sentences about figuring things out and making the right moves. Christine wasn't convinced. She knew Kody better than most, better than he would ever admit. And his sudden shift wasn't just stress or frustration, it was fear. Meanwhile, Janelle had her own growing doubts to contend with. Kody had dragged her into a string of tense, private discussions that led nowhere. He hinted at difficult decisions and things he can't talk about yet, and she was emotionally spent, worn out from the mental gymnastics alone. She could tell he wanted something from her, approval, support, validation, but he wasn't giving her the truth in exchange. And if there was one thing Janelle hated, it was being shut out of her own life. Always trying to mediate, Robyn instinctively knew that Kody was spiraling under the pressure of something he wouldn't share. She grew increasingly protective, quietly corralling conversations away from sensitive topics and stepping in anytime the wives asked for clarity. But even Robyn could do only so much. The secret was bigger than her, bigger than this family, and no amount of smoothing things over could stop what was coming. The wives had started to cross-reference their stories. Subtle inconsistencies, strange decisions, sudden financial moves, a new pattern of control that felt designed, deliberate, and alarmingly desperate. Even Meri, who had grown used to being on the emotional outskirts, noticed that Kody was acting like a man cornered, not by his wives, but by his own choices. Suspicion became quiet investigation. Christine began to ask the bigger kids if they had seen anything peculiar. Janelle dug through months of messages, plans, and family schedules, finding gaps where there never used to be any. Meri, after years of learning to sense emotional undercurrents, could feel fear that Kody was trying to hide. None of them had the complete picture yet, but they were closer than Kody knew. What truly pushed things over the edge was a moment that seemed small from the outside. A small moment, really. A simple question, a slip of the tongue, a trace of truth escaping Kody's lips before he was able to catch it. Christine had asked him, point blank and straightforward, why he'd just scrapped plans for a family meeting that had been arranged for weeks. Kody, apparently unnerved, snapped at her that he had to deal with something that didn't concern anyone else. Then, in the same breath, he muttered something about not wanting them to find out the wrong way. The room fell silent. Christine froze. Janelle stared at him. Even Robyn couldn't speak. Kody knew immediately he had said too much, and the regret flashed across his face before he could mask it. It was the moment everything shifted. The wives realized that whatever Kody was hiding wasn't just an issue with him, it was something that impacted the entire family. Questions poured out, one after another, and he couldn't dodge them all. What was he concealing? Who would uncover it? What did he mean by the wrong way? Kody fumbled his way through vague, contradictory answers with growing irritation at every tick of the clock. The more he tried to wrest control over the situation, the more his panic became transparent, and the wives were done with silence. Later that night, after Kody stormed out of yet another confrontation, the wives gathered without him. The discussion was raw, honest, and long overdue. Christine admitted she had been suspicious for months. Janelle revealed financial inconsistencies that didn't make sense. Meri shared emotional red flags she had picked up long before anyone else noticed. Even Robyn, hitherto the one who always defended Kody against his other wives, confided that he had been keeping even her at arm's length. It soon became clear that whatever Kody was hiding involved the whole family, and it had gone on far longer than any of them suspected. The wives made a decision, one that would change everything. They would stop waiting for the truth. They would uncover it themselves. And it didn't take long. One discovery connected to another, and questions led to answers Kody never intended for anyone to see. The closer they came to uncovering the full truth, the more obvious it became that Kody's biggest fear wasn't losing control of the family, it was losing the narrative he had carefully built for years. The truth was far more explosive than the wives imagined, and the moment they confronted him with what they had unearthed, everything the Brown family had ever known was about to be shattered. The wives finally sat down with Kody in an unusually quiet house. Thick tension could be felt in the air, and even Kody was disturbed, although he had grown used to controlling the energy of every conversation. Immediately, he knew this wasn't going to be one of those usual fights. This was final. It was Christine who spoke first, and she did so without anger, but with a quiet firmness that instantly set Kody on edge. She said they knew everything, not the little things he assumed they were upset about, but the real truth he'd been keeping for years. The truth that connected every inconsistency, every disappearance, every shift in his behavior. The truth he had never intended for the family to find out on their own. Kody tried to interrupt, but Janelle jumped in, laying out the financial documents that she had quietly collected and reviewed, money moved without explanation, plans made without the family's knowledge, commitments shrouded behind ambiguous statements and abrupt decisions. She spoke with precision, her voice steady, weighted with the sting of betrayal. And then Kody's face lost its color as he realized just how much she'd uncovered. Before he could defend himself, Meri added what she'd learned: conversations overheard, calls taken in secret, moments where his behavior had slipped just enough to reveal patterns he couldn't explain away anymore. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle Kody didn't even know the wives were assembling. But the moment that broke him came from the person he least expected, Robyn. For the first time, she faced him not as an ally, but as one who had finally accepted the truth he had tried with all his might to bury. She informed him that he had kept even her in the dark about certain meetings, conversations, and plans that directly touched their future. She admitted she had defended him for years, often against her better judgment, and now, more than anyone else, she wanted answers. In that moment, Kody knew he was surrounded, but not by enemies. Rather, he was surrounded by the truth he could no longer run from. He tried to compose himself, but the pressure was just too strong. The secret he had spent years burying unraveled right in front of the very people he had hoped to protect, or perhaps control. The wives waited, silent and unwavering, affording him no escape. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, strained, and unfamiliar. He started to explain what was really going on, the impossible situation he had gotten himself into, the mistakes he had made, the escalating fear with every passing year. He could acknowledge that he had been concealing a huge personal and financial crisis, one he felt would destroy the family if anyone should ever find out. He had been making deals, promises, and decisions in secret, hoping that somehow he might get everything straight before it was discovered. But instead of solving the problem, he had allowed it to grow larger, which he was no longer capable of controlling. The wives listened to him without interrupting. Every confession hit them differently. Some felt shocked, others felt betrayed, and some felt strangely relieved because at least now, finally, they had the truth. Suddenly, the weight of years of confusion and emotional chaos was visible on Kody's face as he spoke. He wasn't the confident patriarch he once presented himself to be. He was a man who had spent far too long pretending to hold things together. When Kody was finally done, the silence in the room returned, not because the wives didn't have anything to say, but because they knew too well that nothing could ever return to what it was. Understanding the truth didn't erase the damage it had caused. Trust had been broken in ways that couldn't simply be repaired with apologies or explanations. Christine stood up first. Knowledge didn't change her decision. She was still moving forward with the life she'd chosen, one based upon independence and clarity. Next, Janelle spoke of needing space to really consider what this meant for her future. Meri, who had lived in emotional limbo for so many years, simply nodded and quietly walked away, her silence more powerful than anything she could have offered. Even Robyn, torn and heartbroken, admitted she needed time to process everything she'd just heard. Kody reached out verbally, trying to prevent the complete fracturing of the family, but it was too late. The truth had finally surfaced, and along with it, that illusion which had held this family together for such a long time collapsed. Everyone walked away from the conversation knowing the Brown family had permanently changed. Later that night, after the wives had gone to their rooms and the house settled into stillness, Kody sat alone in the living room. The silence was heavier than the confrontation itself. He realized he had always feared this moment, not just because his secret was exposed, but because the truth forced him to confront the one thing he had avoided for years: accountability. For the first time, he realized that the family wasn't falling apart because of his secret, but because he had never trusted them enough to share it with them. He had tried to protect his pride, his image, his sense of control, and in doing so, he had pushed away the people who once believed in him the most. The wives, in their quiet spaces, digested the conversation in their own silence, painful, confusing, disappointing, and yet somehow liberating. All of these years had been spent in shadow, half-truths, and shifting stories. Now, at least, the truth was out. Now they could breathe. Now they could move on, healing or separating forever. And that was the moment the Brown family crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Not because the secret destroyed them, but because revealing it finally forced them to see where they truly stood with one another. The truth had ended one chapter and started a new one none of them could predict.